So these first notes are going to go over the European theater. These are going to help you complete your project because it's going to outline kind of the course of the war in the European theater. The European theater is going to include a lot of different areas, and how I'm going to do this is I'm going to do it by the different fronts and the different areas that were fought in and not just chronological. That way it's more organized. So as you're doing your project, you can really pick out things of what your person would have seen and where they would have been. Important vocab for this part is going to be first and foremost blitzkrieg. So blitzkrieg is what's called lightning war, and this is going to be the German idea during World War II, where they combine their new advancements in air warfare and using tanks and speed to quickly overcome an enemy and destroy it. If you remember back to World War I, where World War I was a very slow war, the Germans are going to use blitzkrieg. So think of like a blitz in football, where they're going to rush the enemy as fast as they can to overcome like the defenses they have. The Luftwaffe is going to be just the German Air Force whenever you hear about that. VE Day is Victory in Europe Day. And then just some basic terms that you're going to see throughout this unit are going to be theater. So if you remember back to World War I, a theater is the geographic area where a war is occurring. So this is the European theater, which means the war is generally going to be occurring in Europe. And a front is the place where two or more armies are actually meeting each other and fighting. Occupy and occupation just means taking over and controlling a country. You're going to see that a lot in regards to the Axis taking over and controlling countries. And the Rhine River is just the main river that separates Germany from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands that the Allies are going to have to cross to actually get into Germany. So the first place that we're going to focus on is going to be the Western Front. And the Western Front is pretty much going to be focused on this area that I am circling here. It's going to run all the way into Germany. Obviously, southern France down here, I should include that. It's also included. But it's going to be mostly this area here, just like it was during World War I. That's going to be our Western Front. It's going to be Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Canada, the United States versus Germany, Italy, and its allies. So most of the time I'm just going to refer to these guys here as the Allies and Germany and Italy as the Axis. It's going to take place mostly from 1939 all the way into Germany's surrender in 1945. So after the invasion of Poland, which we went over in our last notes, the war kind of sits around for a little bit while everybody's waiting for something to happen. The Allies expect the war to be just like it was back in World War I, so they don't really attack Germany. But all of a sudden in 1940, Germany uses its blitzkrieg. It uses that new kind of lightning war to quickly conquer most of Western Europe. And you can see here they use planes like the Stuka dive bomber, they use half-tracks, tanks, they quickly overwhelm the Western European countries. So in April 1940, they occupy both Denmark and Norway, but then in May 1940, and this is going to be the really important one right here, they occupy Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. So the reason that the Germans invade Belgium again is the French had built this thing called the Maginot Line. And the Maginot Line was this massive series of fortifications and forts that the French had built along their border with Germany. And the Germans know they can't go through it, so what they do is they go up and around through Belgium and the Netherlands, come down behind the forts, take Paris, wipe out the French army, and France falls apart. The British army falls back to this little port on the coast called Dunkirk, and they're able to evacuate their army from France back to Britain. The importance of this is that the British army isn't captured and destroyed over in France, so it's able to escape across the English Channel back to Britain so it can defend its homeland. You can clearly see the blitzkrieg here, and how quickly Germany kind of conquers most of Western Europe. So their first thrust up into Western Europe is going to be this way, into Norway and Denmark. And then this area that I'm going to put a line in blue, this is where the Maginot Line was. So this is way too fortified for the Germans to get through. So the Germans just decide to invade through this area, the Netherlands and Belgium, come down, take France, cut off the French army, capture the entire French army, and destroy it. Then the English, just like we had in the notes, about right here, bring their army back to Great Britain so that they can continue fighting the war. So at this point in time, the only free nation in Europe really left standing will be the British to resist the Nazis. You can see the occupation of France here. So France is broken up into two different areas. There's the northern zone, which is going to be occupied France, and this means the Germans actually have control of it. And then you're going to have the southern zone, which is technically like free France, but the Germans like puppet that area, so they're kind of in control of it also, but it's technically the French government. And then that leads us to the Battle of Britain. So Britain's the last democracy left standing, really, in Europe, and they are on their own fighting the Germans. So from July to October, the Battle of Britain occurs, and the unique thing about it is it's entirely fought in the air. There's no actual ground troops attacking each other. It's the two air forces trying to destroy each other so the Germans can try to invade Britain. They have to control the skies so they can get their troops across the English Channel to get into Britain. What the Germans eventually begin to do is something called the Blitz, where if you look at this picture right below the text, they begin bombing British cities, and the goal is to break the British morale. They want to kill as many British citizens as possible. They want to destroy all their cities, so the British people say this war isn't worth it, we're done, and they will end the war. The significance of this, though, is Britain actually wins the Battle of Britain. They destroy enough of the German Air Force that the Germans decide it's not worth it. They abandon their plans to invade Britain, and Britain survives as kind of an outpost of democracy to begin to take the fight to the Germans eventually. Now, I know it seems like we made quite the jump from 1940 to 1944, but this is because the Allies were focused on other areas. You'll see this as you go through the notes. But the next big thing that happens in the Western Theater is Operation Overlord, or D-Day, on June 6, 1944. And this is the long-planned Allied invasion of France. So the Allies are made up of, at this point, the Canadians, the British, the Polish, the exiled Czechoslovakian government, the Dutch, the Belgians, and now the Americans. And they need to open up a second front on the Germans because the Germans are currently fighting the Soviets, and the Soviets need the Allies to open up this front in France to bring troops, to make the Germans bring troops over and focus on them as well. So the Allies land on these beaches here in Normandy, France, and begin to slowly push the Germans back in Western Europe. D-Day is a significant event because it's actually the turning point on the Western Front, and this is where the Allies open up that second front on Germany, so the Germans are now fighting both the Soviets in the east and the Allies in the west, and they're kind of stuck in the middle. Just some pictures here from D-Day. You can see landing on the beaches, troops having to cross all these beaches while the Germans are up here firing down on them. Germans laid traps all over the beaches, barbed wire. It was one of the most dangerous invasions in history. Throughout 1944, then, the Allies continue to push towards Germany. So they liberate most of Western Europe, moving across places like France, Belgium, the Netherlands. An entire German army is surrounded and destroyed in France. And then the Allies try what's called Operation Market Garden. This is an offensive where they drop a bunch of paratroopers into Belgium and the Netherlands and try and quickly take those areas so that they can cross into Germany, invade Germany quickly, and try and end the war by Christmas in 1944. Operation Market Garden is a huge failure, and the Allies are actually defeated and pushed back a little bit, and Germany obviously is able to continue the fight into 1945. Finally, in the Battle of the Bulge, this happens in December of 1944 into January of 1945, so right around the New Year. The Germans attack the Allies in Belgium, and this is kind of the Germans' like last gasp of their army. They take everything they have and they throw it at an area where the Americans are holding the line in Belgium, right above France. The Americans barely are able to defeat the Germans, but the significance of this is it exhausts the German army. So think of this as like a second wind in a sport where you're already tired, you're already exhausted, but you suddenly get that last burst of energy. But after you get that last burst of energy, you're tired, you're done, you can't play anymore. And that's kind of what the Germans do. It's called the Battle of the Bulge because you can see when the Germans push their offensive, it literally creates a bulge in the Allies' lines where they push the Allies back. But eventually the Americans are going to rush in enough reinforcements that they will collapse this bulge and kind of restabilize the line. After the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies continue to push the Germans back, and eventually they get to the Rhine River, which, as you remember, is that border between Germany and Western Europe. The Allies cross the river in a huge battle, and throughout April and May of 1945, they continued to push the Germans back until on May 7th, the German army formally surrenders to the Allies, and on May 8th, 1945, the Allies declare VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, with the German government surrendering to the Allies. You see Winston Churchill, the leader of Britain here, celebrating with all the people of London the victory of the Allies in Western Europe. That brings us to our next area, which is the Eastern Front. So now we're going back all the way to the beginning of the war again, and I'm going to give you the Eastern Front. So the Eastern Front is primarily going to be this absolutely massive area here, stretching all the way from Finland to Germany to Czechoslovakia, Austria, down through Romania. And it's primarily going to be fought between the USSR and Germany. Those are going to be our two big ones. And this is actually going to be like the area where most German soldiers are engaged in the war. The Western Front was almost like a sideshow for Germany. This is where the big battles occur, the USSR and the Germans. And it's going to stretch from about 1941 to 1945 when the USSR and Germany go to war. So the Eastern Front kicks off in 1941 with the German invasion of the USSR called Operation Barbarossa. This is one of the largest invasions in history. It's over 3 million German soldiers, and it is a massive German success. The Germans push into the USSR, and if you look at the picture on the right here, this whole area in red, the Germans absolutely just steamroll. They destroy the Soviet Union. They capture whole armies. They kill millions of men. They take whole cities in days. And Moscow, the capital of the USSR, is almost taken. The city of Leningrad, which is up here, is actually besieged. And it's going to be one of the longest sieges in history where the city's totally cut off. People are starving. They're forced to eating rats and eventually cannibalism even. So it looks like the Soviet Union is going to fall to the Germans for the longest time until the Battle of Stalingrad. So Stalingrad is located right here in southern Europe, or in southern Russia, and it sits on a place called the Volga River, and it's very important to the Soviet Union because below it, if you look down here in yellow, this is where the Soviets get all their oil from. So Hitler's goal is to turn his army, capture Stalingrad, capture all the Soviets' oil, so now the Soviets can't supply their tanks and their planes, but the Germans can supply theirs. And it turns out to be the largest battle in history. So the city is obviously named after Stalin, so Hitler wants to take it, and Stalin wants to keep it because they both have huge egos. And they just pour men and materials into the city. We're talking millions of men fighting this battle. It's the largest battle in history. Millions are killed. But the significance is this is the turning point on the Eastern Front. So while D-Day was the turning point on the Western Front, Stalingrad is on the Eastern Front. It ends in a USSR victory, and this means no more German offensives on the Eastern Front. After this, instead of the Germans attacking the Soviet Union, it is going to be the Soviet Union now pushing the Germans back and attacking the Germans until their defeat in 1945. You can just see the characteristics of Stalingrad here. The entire city is pretty much leveled by the end of the battle. They're fighting over effectively nothing. After Stalingrad in 1943, the Soviet Union is now on the offensive. The major battle in 1943 is going to be the Battle of Kursk, and the Germans launch this huge offensive using tanks. You can see all the tanks here. It's the largest tank battle in history, one of the largest battles in history after Stalingrad, but the Soviets defeat it, and the Germans kind of exhaust themselves on the Eastern Front. Through 1944 to 1945, it's more of the same of the Soviet Union pushing the Germans back and slowly collapsing the German offensive. The siege of Leningrad is lifted. You can see Leningrad was very desperate. Families didn't even have anywhere to bury their children. Children were manufacturing weapons for the Soviet Union. The Soviets begin to occupy a lot of Eastern Europe. They push into Poland. They push into Czechoslovakia slowly. And Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, which are all part of the Axis, surrender to the Soviet Union, who pretty much occupies and conquers their countries. We're going to go over these countries being part of the Axis a little later in the notes. So the end of the war in the Eastern Front happens also in 1945 with the surrender of the German government. The USSR in 45 invades Germany, and the USSR is actually going to be the one to take Berlin. So in the Battle of Berlin, obviously the Soviets take the city. You can see it's pretty much entirely destroyed here. Hitler commits suicide in his bunker, and the German army surrenders, and the war in Europe is effectively over. So one of the things that's going on during this whole time when the war is occurring is going to be the bombing campaign against Germany and Italy by the Allies. And this is going to happen right at the beginning of the war, and it's going to last all the way till the very, very end of the war. So the bombing campaign is where the Allies use their heavy bombers to try and destroy Germany and Italy's abilities to make war and its army. So the British do a bombing by night because it's harder to see your bombers at night, it's harder to shoot them down, but it's also harder to hit your targets. This is called saturation bombing. So if you think about saturating a towel, it's where you put the towel totally in water and you get it completely soaked. So saturation bombing is basically doing that with bombs. You pick out an area to bomb and you level the entire area. If you hit neighborhoods, that's okay. If you hit factories, that's okay. If you hit a school, that's sorry, but it was in that area. The Americans, though, we picked to do what's called a strategic bombing, which is bombing by day. So obviously at day you can see your target better, so you're more likely to hit it, but also the enemy can see you, so you're more likely to get shot down. And the Americans try to target very specific targets. So they pick a political building, or they pick a factory district, or they pick a military target, and they try and hit it. So there's just two different ways of bombing Germany. And Italy. This is going to be very, very destructive over the war. Whole cities are going to go up in fire, and it's going to cause a lot of the damage that you see at the end of the war. The other kind of front that is going on during the whole time in Europe is the Battle of the Atlantic. So this is going to occur out here in the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and Africa and the Americas over here. And it's going to be between mostly the United States, Canada, and Britain, and Germany. By the end of the war, it's pretty much going to be the United States fighting it, but this happens the entirety of the war as well. So the Battle of the Atlantic is more about supplies. So the Germans go back to World War I, and they try and use their U-boats again to cut the Allied supply lines. So the United States and Canada are supplying Britain, and they're supplying the governments in Europe and the Soviet Union, and eventually their own troops while they're in Europe. And the Germans don't want that. So they send their U-boats out into the Atlantic to hunt any ships that are bringing those supplies over. The Allied goal is obviously just to keep those supply lines open. So during this battle, the U-boats are used, and at first they're very effective. They almost starve Britain into submission, but eventually new technologies like sonar, which is basically radar underwater to detect submarines, give the Allies the edge. The Allies begin hunting down and sinking the U-boats, and the supply lines to Europe do stay open. Now, if you remember back to D-Day, there was that little jump between 1940 and 1944 where the Allies didn't really do much on the Western Front. That's because they were distracted with other areas, and those areas are going to be North Africa here and Italy. So this little section of the notes is going to focus on North Africa right here and the battles that occur in it, and it's going to be Britain, France, and the United States, again later on the United States, first Germany and Italy. And it's going to happen pretty much from 1940 till 1943. So in September in 1940, the Italians and the Germans invade British-controlled Egypt. So if you look down here, they invade this area. So the Italians and the Germans push out and they invade Egypt down here. Their goal is to take Egypt and cut off the British's access to India and their supplies to India. The British stop the Germans at this area over here, El Alamein, and then they begin pushing the Germans slowly back across North Africa. Then, at Operation Torch, the Americans land in this area here and begin pushing the Germans and Italians back. And eventually the Germans are trapped in between the Americans and the British, and the Axis have to retreat back to Italy and out of North Africa. So you can see here it's originally the Axis attacking the Allies, but then the Allies pushing the Axis out of North Africa. The significance of the North African campaign is it's an Allied victory and it just kicks the Axis out of North Africa. So now there's one less area that the Allies have to fight, but also over 275,000 Axis troops surrender. This means a large portion of both the Italian and the German armies are trapped and are basically taken out of the fight by the Allies. The Italian campaign then follows the North African campaign. So the Italian campaign is going to be focused, obviously, in Italy and Sicily. And it is going to be the Allied powers, some of the countries are Britain, the United States, and even Brazil, versus Germany and Italy. So at first, the Allies invade Italy in 1943, and they begin working their way up the Italian peninsula, and it eventually leads to the Italian people overthrowing Mussolini, their dictator, in 1943. The Italians try to switch sides, but then the Germans take control of Italy. So the Germans actually invade Italy from the north. They set up Mussolini as like a puppet ruler in northern Italy to continue the fight, while the Allies control southern Italy. And fighting is going to continue all the way till the end of the war in 1945. So the Allies never officially push the Germans totally out of Italy. And the reason for this is, if you look in this bottom picture, Italy's super mountainous, so the Germans are easily able to defend it, so the fighting just continues throughout the war. The significance of this is Italy is pretty much taken out of the war because Mussolini is overthrown and the Germans have to take over, and now there's another front that Germany has to fight on. So the Germans at this point would be fighting on the Eastern Front against the Russians, or the Soviets. They'd be fighting in Italy against the Allies, and then a year later, after the Allies invade Italy, they would invade in France, and there would be even another front opened up on the Germans. The final area we're going to talk about is Southern Europe. And we're just going to say Southern Europe is this area I'm circling in red here. So it's going to be the Allied powers, Britain and Greece, the United States a little bit, but Yugoslavia down here versus Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. And this is going to last from 1940 all the way into 1945. So the Axis began to expand into Southern Europe, and they got some new allies. So they got places like Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, who all joined the Axis in 1940. So they joined in with Germany and Italy. And what really kicks it off is the Axis occupied Greece in 1940. The Italians and the Germans occupied Greece down here. And then the Germans occupy Yugoslavia. Now, the reason for the German occupation of Yugoslavia is, A, they just want to get to Greece, and Yugoslavia is in the way, so they want to take it so they can get there, and they're getting ready for their invasion of the Soviet Union. So they want to control this whole area so they don't have to worry about anything, so they can throw all their troops against USSR. Southern Europe is pretty much going to be under control of the Axis powers for most of the war until 1944, when the USSR begins to push into this area, and they're threatening to cut off all the Germans down here, so the Germans have to pull all their troops out of these areas and retreat back into Germany. So I hope this helps you understand the war in Europe a little bit, in the European theater, and it can help you on your project, and you can kind of click through these slides and pick out some events and research more on your own. But if you need any help, just let me know.